And I'm just going to go ahead and get started with the conversation. So, to both you, Amy and Gabino, just by ways of introduction, could you guys share a little bit about yourselves and maybe who you are as a writer?
Amy, please.
Oh, goody. I'm glad I got to go first. I'm Gentry. Thanks for having me on the panel. I write novels of suspense. At least that's mostly what I've written so far. My debut was in 2016. Good as Gone is somewhere behind me. And Last Woman Standing came out last year. I have a third coming out in early 2021 called Bad Habits. And I would say, as a writer, I didn't know I didn't know that I was going to be a mystery and suspense writer. Actually, I started out just by writing about the things that I wanted to write about, and that's where I ended up. I would call all of my thrillers feminist thrillers. That's what they've been called. So yeah, I think that probably covers it.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here. I'm happy to be here with Amy. Not as happy as I was at the beginning because Bad Habits was going to be the title of my memoir. So I guess now I'm going to have to change it. I'm Gabino Iglesias. I write, I got tired of having to explain it, so I write a thing that I decided to title Barrio Noir. It occupies the interstitial space between crime fiction, noir, and horror. And who am I as a writer depends on the time of day and my mood. Sometimes I'm a dumpster fire, and some days I'm in complete control of what I'm doing, and I can write for a couple of hours. And I'm a huge fan of all three genres. I'm a book reviewer, been a professional book reviewer for 10 years. If I spent the same amount of time writing that I do reading, I would probably be much more productive. But there will be a new book next year. Last one came out at the end of 2018. Coyote Songs was nominated for a Locust and a Bram Stoker and won the Wonderland Book Award for Best Novel. And we'll see where the next one goes. And I'm currently accepting suggested titles for my memoir because Amy ruined that. So yeah, reach out.
In the chat box.
What's the title of the one that's coming out next year? Can you tell?
I have no idea. Yeah, for Zero Saints, I had a title from the get-go. For Coyote Songs, I came up with like 30, and we ended up choosing one. And I don't know what to call this one. I suck at titles.
Is it stories or a novel? Or
it's a novel, yeah. So
yeah.
I don't know. I'll keep you posted.
Well, we can always suggest maybe that by the end of the
Right. I would love that. Yes, I'll take notes.
I love that. Okay, great. So we'll just jump right into the questions then. So I always like to ask, like, when did you know, if you know the specific moment, but when did you know that you were a writer, like a capital W writer? Like, this is what I want to do, or this is kind of like a path I want to follow?
Laughing. Do you have one in mind, or you want me to go first?
It's a question that comes up a lot. I was in fourth grade. No, it was much older. I was probably in seventh grade, and it was one of my first English classes. I'm not a native speaker, so I was learning how to write English. So they made you write things, and we had a project. We had to create a little magazine, and I wrote a story for it, in which a woman in my neighborhood, I didn't know about changing names and stuff back then, so I used real names and real people in my story. Had a demonic child that she hid in the basement, and the demonic child breaks out and slaughters everyone in the neighborhood. And so my parents got called to school, and we sat there, and everybody was angry at me. And my dad asked one question. He said, "Well, is it well written?" And then I realized, this is so cool. I want to do this for the rest of my life. And I've been getting in trouble with words since, or trying.
Love it.
It's so awesome. I want to read that story.
It's somewhere. My mom still has it somewhere. I know. Yeah.
It's funny, I gasped at the beginning because mine is in fourth grade too, but it's not nearly as cool as yours. But I had a little hippy dippy teacher named Mr. Wainwright in fourth grade, and I didn't have like a lot of friends because we just moved across country in the middle of the school year.
All right.
So this teacher kind of gave us this like free verse poetry assignment and explained to us that poetry didn't have to rhyme, and just kind of gave us a bunch of nature scenes. And I just like suddenly it was like a door unlocked, and suddenly I was like writing this tormented, angsty poetry as a fourth grader about how alone I was. It was, and this teacher being a real sweet guy, and you know, was like, "This is terrific. Write more of it. Just bring me more poetry. Doesn't have to be for class." So I just spent the whole year like, just, you know, getting all this individual, you know, sort of praise and recognition for basically just vomiting my feelings, and I've been doing it ever since.
Love it. Whomst among us to not get their start vomiting about our feelings in words? You know, that's why we're all here. But oh, that's so cool. I always like kind of like hearing those like touch points in people's lives. So
they both involve teachers is very suggestive.
Yes. Yes, teachers play such an important role. I know it was definitely because I had like a high school teacher who pulled me aside, and he must have been so inspired by some like assignment I had to do that he's like, "Have you ever tried creative writing?" And I'm like, wow, I didn't realize my analysis of The Great Gatsby would show my potential as a creative writer, but here I am. So that's really exciting. If you're a teacher out there watching, we love you. Thank you for inspiring people. I'm also curious, what brought you specifically to this genre, mystery, thriller, horror? What was it that was kind of the starting point?
Amy, take this one first.
Oh, you're the one that started there, so I feel like you're the one to answer it. But yeah, I just started writing. I've always liked really dark, unpleasant things. And I think when I was in grad school for something complete for English literature, not writing, but I started reading a lot of Patricia Highsmith and Ruth Rendell and Barbara Vine, who's her nom de plume as well, and kind of weird, patchy kind of education in it. But when I came out of grad school and started wanting to write a novel, I thought that it was just this family drama, melodrama maybe even, about mothers and daughters and misrecognizing each other. And then I just realized at some point that actually it was like there were dead bodies in it. So maybe it was crime. And around that time also Gone Girl had come out like a couple of years before. I was unknowingly in a boom of female penned, female charactered crime fiction and suspense fiction. And so for better or for worse, I got kind of slotted in with that genre and kind of discovered a world of crime and suspense that I didn't even know anything about. So I began to educate myself rapidly, which is probably the worst thing you can do, actually. And now I have found weirdly that my tastes, I'm a little bit dulled on crime, and so I'm starting to veer toward horror more. And finally kind of I never read Stephen King as a child. I never really, started watching horror movies about 5 years ago for the first time, and then quickly went all the way in.
Yeah.
And I think, somehow this pandemic time is just making me want to go darker and darker. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about horror.
Come to the dark side. We got cookies. So my journey was sort of the other way around. There was the readily available Poe and Lovecraft and all those folks. I could get those at school. Some of the adults that I knew had gigantic hardcover collections. So sort of cosmic horror and old-timey horror was my intro. My country is 100 miles long by 35 miles wide, so there wasn't a lot of bookstores. But then in my early teens, we got Borders for the first time. So as a young broke person, I would go there, and they had a table at the entrance of the store with like $3.99 per paperbacks. And those paperbacks only had horror and crime. It was Jeffrey Deaver, Patricia Cornwell, James Patterson, all those folks, and then Stephen King, Richard Lehman, Jack Ketchum, Brian Keene, Bentley Little. And so I just consumed massive amounts of those really cheap, awful, tiny lettered paperbacks. And for me, they always went hand in hand. So I always gravitated toward both. Like, give me some cosmic horror, and a hard drinking PI with a fedora and a femme fatale, like sort of like that space in the middle. That was me. I would just switch back and forth. So I never said I'm gonna do one. It was always I have to do both. So yeah.
That is so cool. And I was thinking, as this panel was coming together, that we were putting, probably for the first time in WLT's kind of programming, that mystery and thriller and horror were put together. And I really liked that because I'm a horror writer myself. And I was like, oh my gosh, like the more I learned about mystery thriller, the more I learned about horror, the more I was like, there's so much that kind of connects these two genres. So I think it's really cool to talk about them in conversation with one another. And I also love, Amy, that you mentioned, you're like, well, this story that I'm writing, I guess there's dead bodies in it. So this is the way this story is going to go. And that's, I think, a lot of times that our stories kind of do that. For me, it's like, well, there's a ghost here, so I suppose this might be like a paranormal horror thing. I was set out to write something else, but here we are. And so that kind of leads me to my next question, which is kind of more of a craft question. So I think since we kind of find it both in mystery thriller and in horror and all the things in between, I noticed that you kind of need this like intuitive metronome, right? Like to hit the beats in a story. Like for me, when I'm writing a story, I'm like, okay, there's a ghost. Like, do I put the ghost in the beginning? Do I wait until the end? How like, what if it's too late? Like, what if the emotional kind of resonance isn't what I want it to be? So I'm kind of like wondering, like, when do you reveal the ghost in the story? Like, how do you know when to like maybe like have like a really important moment in your like mystery thriller, you're revealing something, or like horror, you reveal the monster? Like, is there any kind of like planning or anything that goes into that?
I await your answer.
First and foremost, I teach creative writing at Southern New Hampshire University's online MFA, which is a great genre-centric program. And whenever I have discussions with students about their big inciting incident and their big reveal, I let them talk, and then I say, but where did you find the written rule that you can only have one of each per book? And then suddenly their eyes go wide. It's like, you can have more than one inciting incident. I'm like, hopefully you put one in every chapter to keep me glued to the pages. Right. But in terms of horror, it depends. I'm a huge fan of violence in fiction and in real life. I'm a huge fan of violence. So violence can be that gigantic monster, and then you're playing with your reader's expectations. If you want to have the ghost, it doesn't have to be one ghost. And if you give them the ghost in the opening pages, there's a backstory. So this isn't really about the ghost. So the beautiful thing about horror is, yes, we have some unwritten formulas for, we have our haunted houses and our demonic possession, and we have our zombies and vampires and werewolves, and the list just goes on. But the rest is just sort of free reign. It's like you can do whatever you want as long as you keep your readers engaged. With crime, it's a little trickier because I think if we're doing a mystery, we're not going to reveal that in the opening pages. And if we do, it's sort of, haha, at the end, I'm going to come back and tell you that it was a lie, and here's why. Please don't make it a dream. Don't do that at the end of the mystery. But I think at the end of the days, each writer will sit down. This is the narrative that I want to tell. And now I'm going to break my head thinking of the best way to keep you glued and then hold an ace in my sleeve all the way to the end, or to some, a couple of pages from the end, so that I leave you wanting more. And sometimes we even pull it off. So
I love that.
I use 3-act structure pretty much, except that I've started to notice that the last couple of novels I've written seem to want to be like morphing into like 4- and 5-act structure somehow. I don't know. So maybe I'm just going to throw the whole thing out and not think about it anymore. Since I've only really written kind of mystery suspense novels, I would call them psychological suspense. So there's not usually, often the mystery and the suspense comes from, head games, I guess you would call it. So people, people trying to communicate with each other and not knowing whether the other person is, sort of twisting things, gaslighting them. I guess also, when I think of horror, one reason I'm drawn to the genre that I am, and to horror too, is because I am interested in writing about feminist issues. I always kind of have been, even before I knew that was a thing, like in high school, before anyone put me in a women's studies class. And I think that women's existence is pretty horrifying, like in some ways. There's just a dimension of both, like body horror is very, very tied to women's existence. I mean, you've got like parasites growing in your body and trying to like emerge from your stomach like Alien. You've got, you bleed once a month. Sometimes some women do. And just in terms of like your place in society and your position in a patriarchy, or you're sort of in a position to be violated constantly, metaphorically and not. So I guess to me, I go into stories thinking, I already know, like everyone already knows what the monster is, it's not really reveal. And it tends to be in my books, the horror comes more from recognition and from, and I guess, currently this is like a new kind of thing I'm trying to learn and develop, how to bring that into a metaphorical register where there's actual monsters is harder than it sounds, for me. I also, I don't know how to write short stories, so I'm trying to teach myself. Every idea I have thinks that it's a novel, and that's just impractical. So I'm also trying to try out my horror in short stories. I think it's easier also to sustain horror over a short story. So I'm interested in novelists who are able to pull it off. I'm really fascinated and impressed when a novelist is able to keep me scared the whole way through. Because I often find the first act or first half of a horror novel is very scary. And then the second half is often kind of a like the tension, the action is escalating, but the tension is dissipated. So I'm really interested in studying people who, and I would love to take suggestions. I think Gabino probably hasn't nailed, but can also maybe recommend some great horror novels that pull that off.
I'm currently teaching a series of workshops. One of them is titled Horror, Syncretism, and Violence. And the first thing that I say in every workshop is any workshop that tells you you're going to master writing is lying, because we never master this thing. That said, Paul Tremblay's Growing Things is one of the most outstanding short story collections that I've read. And every single short story collection by Brian Evanson tends to be completely shocking. I didn't know you could do this with words, but I'll put together a complete list. And there's so many short story writers like Tanana Ravi do, who she takes the short fiction form, and you cannot read two stories back to back. Sorry?
What is her book that you would, what should I do first? Because I was just online looking at which one.
Oh my God, all of them. It's sort of like, what Octavia Butler would you recommend? You're like, I don't, right? It's like, get all of them, make space, build a new bookshelf and get all of them.
Love that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I want to thank you, Amy, because I've been trying to write an essay about how women write the best domestic thrillers, and I didn't know why. And it's probably because it's not only about the action and the horrors that go on in suburbia. It's sort of like in the middle of this. Yes, I'm white and I'm rich and I got the Mercedes and the white picket fence in the house, but I'm still in this thing where, for example, in the world of literature, in the past 10 days, we've had 17 accusations of sexual harassment and misconduct. So that's your daily life. So I can go to a bar and wait around for 20 minutes looking at my phone. You're a woman, you go to a bar, you can not wait around by yourself for 20 minutes without having some sort of encounter. And I think I'm gonna have to work that into the essay, because that's why they write better domestic thrillers. So,
that's my opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been going to the Springs, to Barton Springs at like 5 a.m. Because that's like when I'm not, like, I'm
socially distanced.
Yeah. 5 a.m. There's like 10 people there. It's a big so I remember the first time I did that, I got there right at 5 and I was so excited. It's my happy place. Barton Springs is absolutely like my place I love to be. And then as I walked through it, I was like, should I be worried that I'm gonna get bludgeoned to death? Oh well, like,
because it could happen.
Constantly, like, I mean, every time you're like out after dark or before light, you just are like, there's like a little running script in the back of your head that's like, how could this become a horror movie? Pretty easily. Oh well, I guess I have to live my life. And so I think that's like the feeling I always want to tap when I'm writing. And I think women, I mean, a good question, Gabino, is not why they write the best fiction, but why women are driven in masses to read. You know, women devour that stuff. And I think it's, you know, I mean, I think there's a real craving to like live through those scenarios mentally and kind of digest them in a way that's like you recognize yourself, but you also have distance. So yeah.
Anyway. You can close it and move. Yeah.
That is so the true beauty, I think, of like horror and mystery thriller, and why I kind of like watch a lot of it and read a lot of it, write a lot of it, is for that reason, because it kind of gives you that safe little space to like just like get all those dark thoughts out, to like be with the monsters and be with the darkness and be with the uncertainty, the confusion, and then you can just like process those feelings. And you know, it's like such a beautiful genre for that reason. So I'm so glad that you both kind of touched on that. It's probably why a lot of people are here right now, is because they're like, I love mystery thriller horror. Like, I love it deeply. It really touches, it's emotional. It's like a really kind of like emotional field, I think. That's kind of like my takeaway from things and things like that. So that's super cool. And I'm inspired too about everything y'all are saying. So just kind of like, you've touched on it briefly a little bit here and there, but just like, if you had to pick like one or two, either like authors or resources, one of each maybe, that have really helped you either in like a business sense or like a craft sense with mystery thriller or horror, like first thing that comes to mind that's really helpful, what would you recommend to these folks? I know there's so much.
I'm still learning, as are we all. I would say Gone Girl was pretty formative for me. It's a pretty big cliche in my genre, but there's a reason why. It's an incredibly enduring example of the genre, and almost nothing that's come out afterward has really touched it in terms of just what it is able to do with an unreliable narrator. What is, you know, it's got a lot of the classic tricks of the genre built in. Unfortunately, some of them have been a bit played out, but it really kind of I remember I was I was revising Godot's Gone, and I already knew I had dual narrators and stuff, but I didn't quite understand how powerful it could be to withhold information from the reader in a particular way in a suspense novel. I will say for horror, one thing that's kind of, there's been a couple of books recently that like made a big impression on me. Although, as Gabino was talking, I was like, oh yeah, Poe, Lovecraft, that's true. Like, I did read those at some point, and I think they're in there somewhere in the back of my mind. But a book I read that is the closest thing I would say to a domestic horror that I've come across. I've been reading a lot of women writing horror. There's actually a couple, but I wanted to highlight. But The Return came out in the pandemic, so I always like want to push it because the people who had books out in March were just didn't get a chance. But this is a book that almost takes a girls' trip, chick lit kind of situation and just drives it full throttle into straight horror town. And it is it's gory, it's violent, it's suspenseful, it's scary as hell. I stayed up late flipping the pages. And the cover kind of says it all. It's like scary and pink. and I was like, I love that. There's something to that in again, like the translation of experience. And then this is another book that I read recently. It's out a little bit. I think it was last year or the year before. The whole. This is kind of a Korean thriller, and there's actually I've been getting a lot of interesting structural points from kind of like the Korean thriller genre that's been I don't know if it's a boom in the genre itself or a boom in translation. They're kind of pouring in for the first time, and again I feel like it's something where I'm seeing a whole different kind of style of horror that appeals to me a lot. I feel like that's just influence. I'm not sure it's useful to other people, but yeah, I don't know.
I'm taking notes. So it works for me.
Yeah, I think the word useful threw me as well, because it's sometimes what I find useful. The story's there, and then suddenly music becomes useful to me on that day. But then sometimes I'm just looking for other types of inspiration, and I'll do. I have a good friend who's a record collector, and the thing that he does is when he finds a record that he really likes, he starts just buying stuff from the same producers, and then that makes a lot of sense. So for me, it's when I find a book that I absolutely love. If it's an indie press, I will just go in and buy 5 or 6. Also, there's a lot of amazing bookstagrammers, folks on Twitter, literary columnists that are like lists are in. And that's great because suddenly you have, you're looking for that one woman in translation. And then suddenly you have, here are 15 women writing thrillers in other languages that you should probably check out this summer. And I know it sounds nerdy, but then I'll just save that list and then I'll try to make my way through it. Some of them are hit or miss, but there's always like at least 1 or 5 gems on those lists. And also I've discovered I don't have enough time or money to fully engage, but social media is absolutely incredible. It's like, I'm looking for this. I haven't read Korean writers. What do you have? And then, you come back an hour later and you have 20 recommendations. I'm looking for an essay on how to hide the eye in my first person narrations. Have you read anything? And then people will just pile on that. Like, when I was teaching this course, we used this book, and I can send you a PDF. And it all eventually becomes sort of like a source to me. It's constant, it's there, it's flowing. All you have to do is ask the right question, and you'll find it. Also, as a reviewer, explore catalogs. Catalogs have nowadays, they're like books unto themselves. They have interviews, they have incredibly rich bios. I reviewed Abahoma's Daughters of Smoke and Fire for the San Francisco Chronicle. And halfway through, I was thinking this is outstanding literature. And halfway through, I realized it's the first sort of thriller by a Kurdish woman that's ever been translated into English. So I realized I was reading history, and that all comes from me pitching books that I saw on catalogs, because sometimes instead of watching Netflix, I'll go through catalogs of what's coming next season. So yeah.
I learn from Goodreads a lot in the same way. It's like, Goodreads has been like the infinite resource for me, because
Right.
it has lists. It has, recommendations that are so much better than something like Amazon recommendations. Or, yeah, I've gone very deep in like threads on Goodreads trying to dig up all that stuff. I will also say, like, in terms of, I forgot to say, and I should have just come out and said, but to me, screenwriting books and craft books are sort of an unending source of help in this area. I mean, I mentioned the 3-act structure for novels, but basically, like, never be ashamed to just go out and you can almost pick one at random, because frankly, any craft book has something to teach you, even if you don't care much about, half of it. It rearranges the furniture in your brain in a way that can really unlock concepts. I mean, at least it does for me. And yeah, I've actually had I have learned a lot from reading things like Save the Cat and Wired for Story, and just basic kind of super accessible writing books on, primarily on either screenwriting or the 3-act structure. Maybe they're also a prison in that I can never understand how to write short stories, but I'll get there.
That is so cool. Yeah, I love the phrase "rearrange the furniture in your brain." I'm going to be thinking about that a lot, I think. I love, Amy, that you like pointed out that screenwriting books are really good, because I have found that screenwriting books have really helped me in terms of dialogue, plot, and screenwriters kind of think about first act, second act, like rising, fall, action, pretty similar to novels, but be comfortable going in and out of different genres and types of writing and mediums and things like that. So I love that. And I love the pitch, Gabino, for reading more works in translation. That is like such an important, wonderful thing. And so support indie presses, support reading works in translation for sure. There's a lot of wonderful contemporary writers out there. And I hope people can
too, I think. Another way to rearrange the furniture in your brain, I think, because you find stuff that you would just never, like, it's some people writing sometimes in completely different ways in the same genre that, like, also super eye-opening. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
That's perfect. No, that's exactly it. It's so wonderful. I work at Malvern Books also. And so if you guys know Malvern Books, they're wonderful. But like they have a lot of books in translation, both fiction and poetry. So you can look them up. We have like a bookshop.org account also. So just a little plug.